Greetings and welcome there, academic proletariat, to this episode of the Fireside Chats with Mr. Olson, where we will, in an off-centered presentation, talk about westward expansion after the American Civil War and hopefully answer the question, what killed the cowboy? So we're talking about the years roughly 1862 to 1890, so if you're obsessed with manifestiny, like many white American males were prior to the Civil War, well, you've got to get in your Peabody and Sherman time machine and go after the Civil War is over, because that's where we're going to go ahead and start this off. But first, let's contextualize things and remind you that westward expansion in American history has been an ongoing process since the very beginning. Ever since the signing of the Constitution, there has been this urge and or impulse to try and expand westward. The first major expansion was, of course, into the Northwest Territory, which happened even before the Constitution was ratified. This, of course, occurred after the Revolutionary War, and by 1783, this land was sort of belonged to the United States. It was officially signed over to the U.S., though, via a treaty in the 1790s, which indicated that the U.S. Constitution knew and could figure out a way to add land. So the next big acquisition was, of course, the Louisiana Purchase, which was bought from France in 1803. After that, in 1818, we added joint occupation of the Oregon Territory in the Northwest, which, of course, provides us the foundation for the epic video game, The Oregon Trail. Adding on to that, we added Florida in the late 18 teens in 1819 with the treaty with Spain, the Adams-Onis Treaty. After that, in the 1830s, we sort of got Texas, but not really, because Texas was on its own, hence the whole Lone Star Republic crybaby nonsense. Anyways, Texas would eventually be annexed in 1844, and in 1845, on the cusp of the Mexican-American War, this is what America looks like. Texas is officially a part of the United States, and there are a bunch of territories. That gray land still belonged to Mexico. However, after said Mexican-American War that occurred between 1846 and 1848 and the Mexican Cession, America now is basically from sea to shining sea. That, of course, means that people in Kentucky can look towards California and say, we can make a march of destiny. The Gadsden Purchase, this little land down here in the southern part of Arizona and New Mexico, was added a couple years later, and then we have our United States. When the Civil War was over, this is, of course, what it looked like, and this will be the beginning of our conversation. How does our angelic America go west? That is going to be the discussion for today. Okay, before we talk about what Americans do in the West, first we have to remind ourselves there were already people there. Hopefully by now this is a moot point, but in the event that you have been taught in the very old school, old-fashioned way, you might have forgotten that, like, this land was already populated by people. So let's remind you of that. Prior to 1862, the West was a very, very diverse landscape. There were Native Americans, of course, that already inhabited that land. There were tribes as diverse as the Sioux, the Nez Perce, the Comanche, and so on. In fact, the Native American life was so diverse out west that it's impossible to even list all of the tribes that lived there. However, one thing that we do want to make note of is that many of the tribes that lived in the Great Plains, so in modern-day states of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, those would have been tribes that relied upon bison for their existence. They used every part of the bison, and this is something that is true while, trotted out there as a stereotype from time to time. Now, in addition to the Native Americans, events prior to 1862 had drawn a fair number of people out there. So there were Mexicans who also already lived there because, it was a part of Mexico before the Mexican-American War. Chinese immigrants were first courted by the gold rush in 1848, but then, of course, they will come in larger numbers during the 1860s and 1870s to work on the railroad. Women also followed men out during the gold rush. So there was a lot happening in the North American West prior to the Civil War. Then the Civil War happens and westward expansion kind of takes a halt because, there's a war on. And then after the Civil War is over, well, westward expansion takes off in a big way. Here are some reasons why this list is not exhaustive, but these are some motivating factors that led people to want to move out west. First of all, I already mentioned the Civil War is over. What do we do with all those guns? Well, can't turn them on each other anymore because, relations are now better. So, is there any other people or things that we Americans can unleash all our silent weapons on? You betcha, Native Americans and bison. And that's what some Americans do in a big way. Some Americans even become bison hunters. They go out specifically to kill the buffalo to A, clear path for the railroad, and B, make it harder for Native Americans to live so they can be more easily subjugated. Wow, this is such an uplifting topic to be talking about. Okay. On a brighter note, one of America's great fetishes, technological innovations. Of course, the railroad brought people out there. Also, wanting to open up markets, particularly with the Chinese, brought people out there. Increasing population out east and increasing population densities. That brought people out there. Demand for more resources, the idea that we were going to spread civilization, can't forget about that one, always there. Religious freedom, particularly among the Mormons, courted them out there. But above all else, there was the idea that out west on the frontier laid some sort of individual opportunity that could be attained. Now, attached to this is the 13th Amendment and the freeing of slaves in the American South, because some of them who have the resources to do so also seek opportunity in the West. So, what are the groups that end up out there? What's their experience like, and what happens to them all? That's what we're going to talk about now. So the first group we're going to check in on is the homesteaders. So homesteaders are people that were probably of a lower social class out east and decided that they wanted a chance to, make it on their own. And they took advantage of a government law passed in 1862, had to be passed during the war because there's no way you get this thing passed if the South is voting, of a free land giveaway. Basically, you could get 160 acres of land in various states that needed a bigger population. And so for a $5 filing fee, you could go out west, stake 160 acres, and as long as you stayed on it for 5 years, you got to keep it. Obviously, this is part of the American dream. I put my hands in the soil and all of a sudden I am a righteous citizen. Doesn't really work that way, and it was a little bit more difficult than it sounds. People, in addition to living in mud houses, which most certainly had snakes and worms, which is horrible, there were also many other difficulties like locust storms, tornadoes, a lack of water, and just overall difficult conditions. Does this look like a place that you would have wanted to lay claim? I don't know. Also, it was hard to sell your stuff because there's not a lot of railroad out there. So homesteaders didn't usually stay, and most ended up moving back east, thus leaving that land to fall into the hands of people that could afford it, and that's corporations, which is why in these Great Plains states today, you see large corporate farming operations. All right, so that's Homesteaders 101. Now let's go on to a special subset of homesteaders, Exodusters. Exodusters were particularly black homesteaders that were looking to escape the persistent conditions of the American South, otherwise known as racism and violence against freed people. And so, in addition to wanting an individual opportunity, large numbers of former slaves from the American South uproot and move to places like Nicodemus, Kansas, which if you know anything about Nicodemus and the Bible, you'll understand that one. Anyways, it's a national park that I would suggest you going to visit. It's really cool. Anyways, it's in the middle of Kansas, so you're probably not going to go, whatever. Anyways, so large number of freed slaves uprooted, left, set down, took advantage of the Homestead Act because they were not exempt, and created communities of free people in the Great Plains. Now, they experienced the same difficult conditions, but in some places they were able to keep it together because they relied upon communities more so than individual homesteaders. Now, some moved back, but many of them stayed. But over time, many of these small farms will turn into corporations, not surprisingly. Okay, next. The railroad is another thing that brings a lot of people out there, and there are large numbers of groups that work either in conjunction with or on the railroad. So first thing, companies were seeking open markets, particularly in East Asia, and therefore they wanted to build a railroad from Omaha to San Francisco, because if you connect Omaha to San Francisco, then all these wonderful goods that are made in places like Chicago, New York, Cincinnati, and whatnot can be shipped to the West Coast and then be sold to Asia. So that's the goal here. Now, workers follow because they need to be the ones building the railroad. Mostly the workers are Irish and Chinese in their ethnic origin. And for the most part, the Irish are building the railroad through the plain states, and the Chinese are building the railroad through the mountains, and are given such harsh tasks of blowing up the mountain with nitroglycerin, which of course is a very dangerous and unstable chemical, and therefore they gave it to the Chinese to use because even the Irish wouldn't touch it. Now, For the most part, if you were working on the railroad, the work was grueling. If you can imagine having to blow through a mountain, the Sierra Nevada, which is one of the most intense mountain ranges in the world, in order to build a railroad, you can kind of get an idea. Now, as a result of all this, and the result of the increased number of Chinese workers on the railroad, there exists a large amount of anti-Chinese discrimination and sentiment. This will eventually culminate in the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is a federal law excluding Chinese people from coming to America, passed in 1881, because by then, the railroad had already been completed, no need for the workers anymore. That railroad is completed in 1869. Now, the railroad companies reap heavy profits, particularly in the form of land grants. As you can probably imagine, like good old American corporations want to do, they built the railroad in such a way that they were able to extract from the government a massive amount of land giveaway as they could. For every mile built, the American government gave the railroad 10 miles on either side as sort of a payment or a subsidy. So the railroad company planned it so it twisted and turned and weaved so that they could get as much land grants as possible. That, of course, is American corporations screwing the public out of their money. An age-old story. Now, in addition to railroaders, miners are also moving out west to strike it big. There was a silver strike in Virginia City, Nevada, called the Comstock Lode that occurred in 1859, and that, obviously, with the interruption of the Civil War, led to a lot of people moving out west. But it wasn't just silver and gold, it was things like copper and lead also that were now being used in abundance in the industrialization process that we'll talk about in later classes. Now, most people that went out west to mine struck nothing, but there were some big strikes that would lead to boom towns, and then all the metal would run out and the boom towns would quickly become ghost towns. And once individuals could no longer dig into the mountain and find any metal anymore, mining fell into the hands of large corporations because they were the only ones who had enough money to buy the equipment needed to get deep enough into the mountain to extract the precious metals. Mining, probably not the most lucky and or hopeful endeavor. Another group, and the most stereotypical of all of them, the Cowboys. Who were they? Well, they were probably former soldiers in the army or freed slaves who were looking for something to do. Many of them probably had guns, and many of them probably didn't have a lot of prospects in the eastern part of the country. So why not go out west and literally walk cows from Texas to Kansas? Sounds like an absolute horrible job, and that's why every cowboy movie is incredibly long, because this is a very, very long walk. Okay, experience of these cowboys, first and foremost, was diverse. There were whites, there were blacks, there were Mexicans, etc. There were even some Native Americans that took part in the whole cowboy thing. So it wasn't just John Wayne on his horse being the only cowboy ever. Okay, it was a very, very diverse occupation. Now, literally, the occupation of being a cowboy only lasts for about 10 years because even though the cowboys, basically took the cows from Texas to a railhead in Kansas or Nebraska, sold the cows off, got cash. They spent all the cash right away, like gambling and in brothels and whatever. Love you, America. But eventually in the 1870s, barbed wire will be invented, which means that people can now breed cows right next to the railroad and be much more efficient, which renders cowboys obsolete. So this age-old mythical occupation is only around for about a decade. Oh, American history, why must you lie to me? The last group, and the one that is most profoundly affected by the whole westward expansion process, is the Native Americans. Their motivation to move out west, they were already there. Their experience involves first trying to make treaties with Americans moving westward. Those treaties in many cases were ignored, which then led to Native American resistance. The two most noteworthy examples of Native American resistance occur at Little Bighorn in 1876, where a group of Sioux warriors successfully defend their land against the American army led by George Custer. But, of course, that success is short-lived, and that the American army just sends more troops with more guns later to finish the job. Another form of Native American resistance occurred with the Nez Perce tribe, led by Chief Joseph, who ran into the mountains in Idaho and Nevada in an effort to try and escape, but eventually they're captured. And actually, Chief Joseph goes to Congress to Lee for the American government to stop the destruction of him and his people. Now, finally, what will happen after the Native American resistance fails is the destruction and assimilation of these Native American tribes at the hands of the American government and its army. So they're going to round up the Native Americans, put them on more reservations. They're going to engage in massacres, the most infamous of which, is Sand Creek Massacre, spelled wrong on the presentation, my apologies. Sand Creek Massacre, which is modern-day Colorado, that occurred in 1864. And then the American government will start passing laws in an effort to try and assimilate these people. So the first thing that they do is they create the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is basically like a government organization to try and answer the so-called Indian question. Now, one way that they deal with this is by setting up schools to turn a Native American that looks like this into one that looks like that. Their motto, quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Their words, not mine. Another example of the American government trying to assimilate the Native Americans is through the passing of the Dawes Act, and this is an important one that you should take note of. In 1881, the American government passes a law that basically takes what used to be communal land on reservations and divides it into individual plots because, Native Americans should live like white Americans on individual plots of land. Well, anyways, they just make the plots really small, and now you've got all this former communal land left over. What do you do with it? You sell it off to white settlers that want to live there, thus leading to the Oklahoma land rush and the nickname Sooners. Now, eventually, Native Americans resort to spiritual attempts to maintain their authenticity and their way of life, and this is when they start participating in the ghost dance. This is, of course, brutally suppressed by the American Army at the massacre of Wounded Knee Creek in 1890. And all the while, there is little done on behalf of the Native Americans by the American government. There is a book written, it's called A Century of Dishonor by Helen Hunt Jackson, which is like an expose of the unfair and unfortunate treatment of the Native Americans, but it has little effect on an American culture, society, political world, and mindset that is committed to settling west until they reach the Pacific Ocean. Now, eventually what happens here in 1890, there's a census, and after Wounded Knee, the census indicates that there is no more land in the West in large numbers that can be settled, and therefore the frontier is closed. What does this mean for the West? Well, no longer does this frontier really exist as an opportunity for Americans to go express their individuality. A historian who was working at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the time, named Frederick Jackson Turner, then offers a frontier thesis in 1893, 3 years later. He says, the frontier has served as this defining American characteristic for a long time. Since it no longer exists, it will create a crisis in the American psyche. We're going to have an identity crisis, and therefore Americans are going to have to figure out something to do, somewhere to go now that the frontier is closed. What does that mean? Well, first the Philippines, and then the moon, of course. This frontier that has tremendously impacted American settlement from the beginning days of our country is gone. What will we do? Just a short recap here. It's important to keep in mind that in this Wild West, there are several motivating factors for people to come out there. The Civil War being over, technological innovation, 13th Amendment, Homestead Act, government is getting into the mix, an increasing population and an increasing demand for resources, and then, of course, finding resources on Native American land. There are some key events that occur during the settling of the West that are important to keep in mind. The Homestead Act, which is the free land giveaway, cattle drives that only occur until the invention of barbed wire, the striking of precious metals like at the Comstock Lode, the finishing of the Transcontinental Railroad that links east and west for the first time, Native American resistance at the Battle of Little Bighorn, government action in the way of the Dawes Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, there are several consequences that we've talked about throughout. I'm going to leave this here for you and just make note that of all the things that happened in the westward expansion, even though it has played a very positive role in the establishing of an American identity, It doesn't necessarily shake out that way for most of the groups involved. That's all the time we've got for today. See ya.